Welcome to Feminine Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Gina Farrar. Each week, I bring you an inspiring conversation to help you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife so that you can not only survive, but thrive in your second half. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. It is Gina here on this lovely Monday morning. And today we're going to be talking about how to survive an empty nest. We're going to be talking about normalizing that and knowing how to handle the emotional aftermath of becoming an empty nester. And to have this conversation, my guest is Denise Broadwater. She's a licensed professional counselor. She's the debut author of A House with Holes. In Kindle, she's the #1 home design and renovation book, and she was #1 hot new release for several weeks on Amazon. So without further ado, I want to welcome you, Denise, to the show. Thank you so much for saying yes to me.
I am so excited to be here and share a little bit about my empty nest.
Yes, this is the first time I've had a good, solid conversation about this, so I'm excited to have this topic on the show because it's really a real thing for many, many women, especially dealing with that shift from a full house to a, quote, empty house, right?
Yes, it is. And I think there are probably varying degrees of intensity depending on the mother and the circumstances, but it is a very real thing. It's not diagnosable mentally. So some people think empty nest syndrome. It's not a diagnosable term, but it's something we regard in pop psychology as a condition. So it's something that we have developed over time to say, you know what, this is a real thing. So
why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What led you to become a counselor and how this impacted your life?
So I became a counselor later in life. It is actually a third degree. And it was because I was an elementary teacher for a number of years and I stayed with my children, which shows that I was a very much involved mother. I taught elementary school where my children were attending. And when they moved to middle school and high school, I thought, I really want to go back to school. And so I started in a nursing prerequisite program to do an accelerated BSN. And over the course of those prerequisites, I realized nursing may not be the right fit. I wanted a little more client contact. And so I have a very medical family, and someone suggested me counseling, and I began to look into it, and it has plenty of client contact. So that's kind of what led me in, is to be able to talk and be with people. I tend to be an empathetic person anyway, and so that was a natural draw for me to be able to sit and come alongside people when they're going through difficult things. That's kind of what led me into counseling. I also, if you think about this, I was in school and they were in high school, which means now 12 years later, my children are through school and actually adults. So I'm a new grandmother. I have one that is 2.5 years old, a grandson, and then I have another grandson with that same family on the way. So I've moved through, but I will tell you, even getting ready for Christmas this year, I feel the pangs of empty nest. So
I can only imagine what that is like to be completely empty nest. I'm not completely empty nest, so I haven't fully experienced that. But before we hit play, you were sharing a quote, a quotable, and I would love to have you share that because it's a good conversation.
The amount of love that we love is the amount of grief that we have. So let's think about that. That's when we have losses such as death, or maybe a family cutoff. See, the amount of love we love is the amount of grief we have. Well, let's move that into the empty nest syndrome area. And why don't we say the amount of involved mothering that we mothered is the amount of emotional emptiness that we might feel once they have left. Because we love our kids. Everyone loves their kids. But that involvement, them being such a part of our lives, perhaps you were close to one or more of your children and you miss them. You miss being involved too in helping them make their decisions and directing them. And you have worries for them. So I thought pairing that with empty nest syndrome, it really makes sense in that pattern.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the amount of love that you give, or the amount of involved parenting that you give, because it really is a sense of purpose for such a large portion of your life. You've done everything you can possibly do for another human as a mother. Everything. Like, I don't think there's anything we don't do as a mother. And I think that's why it's so intense, because it consumes your life for 20, 30 years, depending on how many kids you have. It could be longer than that.
Well, if we can just think of as the progression, you're diapering them, you're nursing them. Look how close the contact is, and you're keeping them alive as a 2.5-year-old. Now that I have a 2.5-year-old grandson, I think, wow, he would run right out the back door and jump in the pond, without any thought. So my daughter-in-law is keeping him alive, by keeping him from himself. And when I see that bond and how as they grow up, then it becomes soccer practice and play dates with friends and who to trust them with as far as playing, rejoicing in their life through birthday parties, and also the suffering and the hardship that school can be, getting their homework done. So there's this huge investment in getting them to where they need to be. It really is a full-time job. And for a mother who maybe works, it's another full-time job. So it's like losing an occupation when you think about it to that degree. And I remember those days. I know that being involved is so key, and then having that hole when you've got a lot more time on your hands. They're doing fine, and you've done your job. But it's hard to still not have some concern for them. It's hard to just totally let go. So suddenly, all of a sudden, you're over it.
Yeah, I don't think it works like that.
No, it definitely doesn't. So the people that I have helped with this, specifically in my office that have come in there, generally there's a frustration over the lack of control. So, they've had such input and they have fears for their kids. And of course, look at our world today. Of course, we have fears for them. They're making huge decisions about the way their life is going to go, who they hang out with, who they date, whether they're attending their class and going to make it through their classes in college if their child is in college, or if they're going to thrive in their job if they've chosen to work. And so we can have worries about that. But if it overtakes our day, then, it becomes excessive. And we need to be able to trust them with what we have taught them. So some of it becomes down to trust and feeling good. When I think of helicopter parent, I look back, and in some ways, I think I was a helicopter parent. But I wanted to not guilt my kids after they left about knowing about every detail of what they were doing. I wanted to begin to trust them. Perhaps you're not totally an empty nest yet. You're looking at it. But instituting some of that trust in how you've raised them, even months before you release them to school, would be a good idea to reduce your emotional distress.
Explain to me, in case some people aren't clear on what a helicopter parent is, what constitutes a helicopter parent?
So that is an excessive generalized worry over a child about what they're doing, the decisions they're making, about advocating in their behalf, especially as they get into teen years when they need to learn to develop negotiating and advocacy skills on their own, say with their teachers, because as they enter college, they're going to have to do that. That is maybe an over-involved parent. We need to be careful when they're young, but we also, that umbilical cord is cut and they begin to march away from us, which is a daily, yearly process, we want to be sure that we are giving them and trusting them as far as we can, honing in when we need to, but letting them fail a bit and make their own decisions so they can learn while they're in our house.
Because there's a lot of people in our age group who still have kids at home. People are having children later, right? So instead of being completely empty, some people in their 50s still have a junior high or a high schooler.
Exactly. And it is easy to take on that role because I feel that we have a lot more fear in our communities than we've ever had. We think about the amount of fear and then the amount of anxiety that the average American is carrying is also high. Our lives are stressful. There are a lot of more stressors on the children. Think of the SAT alone. Parents stress out. They hire somebody to help them. They have to get a certain score. I wouldn't want to admit my SAT score on here. I have 2 graduate degrees, and I wouldn't want to admit that. And these high schoolers are having to, regulate and do that young. They're having to, jump into that competitive pool to get into the right schools and to take on their path. And so, it's easy to stress out for them.
It's interesting. I think when you are going through the process of parenting, and I've shared this with a lot of young parents, is they're your children, but they're another human being. They're not you. They're not going to be exactly like you. They're not going to make decisions like you. They're going to be their own person. In a perfect world, you want them to be their own person. But I think a lot of people want to live vicariously through their children. And I think that's something that if someone recognizes in themselves that they're kind of vicariously living through someone, that's the time when you need to recognize, whose dream is this? Is it mine or is it the child's? What are we pushing our children toward? Because what I see that as is we're not living our own lives. We're living a life through someone else. And that, I think, could intensify the empty nest because we haven't been focusing on what we're interested in or who we are as a person. We've been so identifying with our children and how their life turns out that we lose track of ourselves. We lose ourselves in that process.
And, it can cause frustration within the child. So one of the psychological terms that I often use in my office is called differentiation. Differentiation means that after that umbilical cord was cut, and I just referred to that, each year we're getting farther and farther away from the family of origin. It doesn't mean we don't love them, we don't value them, but we're becoming more and more of our own person. And I have seen adults sit in my office in their 40s just at that time being able to look back and say, wow, I never really saw this in my parents until I was this age because they were still so bonded to them. Bond is important and so necessary. So I want to commend those of you who have great bond to your kids. But you're right, our job is to set them free. If we look at the animal world, isn't that what they do? You've got a lion and a lioness. They have cubs. Those cubs leave and they don't necessarily come back. At least we get to see ours again. They're not rejected fully, but we do want them to stand on their own 2 feet and become the person that God has created them to be and make their decisions and their choices. And it's hard because you know what? We see down the road, don't we? I as a psychologist really see this for my kids because I think, oh, that relationship, look at the unhealthy this and the unhealthy that. And yet that's the last thing my kids want to hear from me is any kind of input when it comes to their relationships. So they have to figure it out, don't they? They have to kind of scrape their knees in the real world. And that's what we're giving them an opportunity to do.
Now, your background, which I happen to know from a previous conversation, is from the Amish community. Now, how did that impact your perspective on these things? Because I know in a lot of Amish communities, the families just kind of continue to stay connected.
Yes, and so my relationship with my mother, because of that, and she was born Amish. Was raised in the conservative Mennonite church. But the thing about my mom is her culture remained with her. So our house was very Amishy in ways. I didn't know until I got out. One time in my 30s, I had a friend, and she goes, Denise, you're not American. I went, yes, I'm American. She said, no. She was actually from Cuba herself. And she said, no, you're not American. And then I said, oh, I'm from the Amish. Because she realized there were things about my home. And I began to actually put that together, that I am a subculture. The Amish have extremely close relationships. You're right. And they actually, because they don't have Social Security, bring the grandparents to stay in what's called a dotty house by one of the children. And they actually live on the same compound. And the children are back and forth with them. So it is a much more closed family system than my children are experiencing in the American system that we have. In fact, they would never want to go back to that. So my relationship getting back to that is closer to my mother than, say, my daughter's is to me. She will go a week and not call me. And, and she's not really a caller. Now, I've had to learn to adjust to that we're close. She loves me, but she doesn't need me. And my mother has definitely fostered that in me, that she needs to talk to me more.
That is really challenging, because the way that I've chosen to parent is with connection. That's been something that's very important to me. But I've also made sure to foster, I have 2 girls, and I really intensely fostered their friendship as they were growing up, protecting that relationship, teaching them the value and the gift of God that it is to have a sister, because friends come and go, people come and go, but your sister is someone that is given to you. That's my perspective.
Yes.
And so together, it in an odd sort of way, when I fostered their relationship, there's times when I'm like the third wheel. Like, we all get along great. We have a great relationship, but their friendship is so strong. Like, it really happened when they went away to college. When one was at college and one was still home, the relationship was still, I had connection with my younger. But when they both went to the same college, then they started relying on each other and texting each other and communicating with each other. Not that they boxed me out completely, but it was interesting. I really felt the shift.
Gina, one of the things that I commend you on is noticing that and not necessarily squelching that. Because, there's going to come a time when they're going to live this life without you. Because we're older, aren't we? And we can get jealous of that sibling bond, or try to come in between and say, I want to be the go-between. I'm your mother.
Yeah.
But I love that you are letting them be friends. They say sibling bond outdoes mother-child bond. Isn't that interesting? And siblings, they can. Now, some siblings don't get along. So if you've got some that just don't click, that happens too. But sibling bond can be very strong. And let's face it, we as parents, don't we love our kids more than they love us?
Oh,
they
yeah.
came from us. We carried them. We have sacrificed life for them. They don't fully get it.
And I don't think they're supposed to, because I really believe that, they didn't choose to be born. That was our decision. So it's unfair to expect them to meet some kind of emotional standard. Personally, I don't.
Absolutely. Well, I totally agree with that. So if we could recognize they came from us, we always have that deeper bond love. We're setting them free. Now, the other thing is, as teenagers and early college, you can do a lot of damage by guilting them, by demanding, by saying, but I've done all this for you. Call me. We want to foster that friendship that says, I'm here. I'm setting you free, but I'm going to give you some of the reins to say we're going to be on a more even friendship basis than we've been.
I was thinking about when you're setting them free, that's actually the greater act of love in many ways for us as empty nesters. The greater love is in the releasing them and trusting them and turning our attention back to our marriages, for example, because empty nest really impacts marriages as well, does it not?
Oh, yes. And I actually am glad you brought up that point because sometimes the emotional stress that we are going through, both father and mother, and I know that it tends more toward women because they're home, their involvement with the children can be greater, but fathers also experience this, and they may be demonstrating it more in anger, more in frustration, instead of in sadness. It depends on their emotional level. But if you can begin to empathize and say, look, we're both in this. We both loved our kids. I remember my husband and I waking up on Saturday morning, which is usually when we were involved. We lived on a lake when our kids were teenagers. We were always out on the lake on the weekends, or if we weren't doing band, because they were all band kids. So we were on the committees to help flags and to do pit crew. We were very involved that way. But I remember after they all three went to college, and ours were all in high school together, they all entered college. It was pretty close. So it wasn't long until we were without a child at home. We sat in bed and we both had tears together and said, we miss our kids. We miss our kids. To be able to sit there and to be there for each other during this time, that can begin to build some of the relationship and the closeness. You were co-parents, and now you're going to be parents of adult children together. And while it's going to change, it doesn't have to tear you apart. It can draw you together.
There's a beautiful relationship that you can have with your spouse after the kids leave. I think the being able to, for some women, I don't know, transition back to, because for some women it really is a one focus thing. It's all about the kids. And I understand that because I'm an all-in kind of parent, because I was very intentional for myself and my home. Like, what do I want my family culture to be? That was important to me, to be mindful of how does this look in our family because of different things I had experienced. And some of them were like, that's not how I want it to be. But in order for it to be different, I had to make a decision, because you do what you know, right?
Exactly.
You're going to do what you know. So I had to be I put a lot of work into doing it differently for me
Yes.
and my family.
To be intentional. And you can think back and see, how did your parents do when you left home? So I remember a story. This is when I was in college. I was a freshman. And unfortunately, my mother married a man after leaving the Amish and the Conservative Mennonite Church that was not real healthy. And there was some estrangement during our teenage years. The bond with Mom was strong. We just weren't able to live there anymore. And so I went to college, and I was up in the upstairs of a stairwell trying to get some privacy. And I was researching a freshman speech that I was going to be giving and practicing. And suddenly I was overcome with this intense fear, and I fell to my knees. And it felt almost as if a thread had been cut. Now, my senior year, I didn't live with my mom, but I thought it was my older sister, Rosie, that she had been in a car accident. I just got this overwhelming feeling that she had been in a car accident, somebody had been hurt suddenly, and I thought it was her. We only had hall phones then. There were no cell phones. And I would have had to make a collect call to call home and say, is everything okay? And I thought they'd think I was crazy, and they definitely used that against me for a long time. I just said, you know what? If something happened, they'll get a hold of me. So a couple days passed, and I was working in the dining hall. I actually had work scholarship. And so I was working in the dining hall, and these two guys in suits showed up. Everybody looked at them, and they all looked at me, and they said, Denise, you need to come with us. And I had to walk to to do an emergency phone call, come in, and they had picked me up out of work, and I thought immediately, that's what that fear was. And so I got into the phone call. My stepfather was there, and he said, Denise, your mom on Wednesday night, that was the night that this happened, was involved in a serious car accident. And she did live through. She would be in the hospital 3 months. She had broken shoulder, and her femur was extremely broken up. That's what took so long to heal. But she may never walk again. There were many different things, and it was really a hard phone call. But I would go home that summer, and what it really did for me was, you know what, Denise, you need to forgive your mom. I was an adult then. I was able to go home and restore things with mom. And it came in that bond-breaking moment, which, you know what, I can't fully explain what happened there that I would know. But I look back, and that was a very healing time for us. I never had to live back in her home again. So my stepfather's issues weren't really related to me. I could always leave if I needed to. And I began to realize I could love my mother where she was. And that really became a basis for me, even in doing therapy, understanding children that maybe they're leaving home, but things weren't really great back home, having to come to terms with who their parents are. And my mom was really gracious as well. So she wanted it, I wanted it, and we worked together. So that's the emptiness on the other end, where I was the child that was leaving. And my mom gave me a lot of independence. She does like that phone call. I talked about that. She's going to be celebrating her 80th birthday coming up. And so we've had a lot of good years, and that abusive relationship ended a few years later. And so I look back, and I'm so thankful for the friendship and the bond that we had that drug us through some of those difficult times as mother and daughter. It gives me hope for my child. Whatever we've encountered, my daughter and I have been the kind that have butted heads. But you know what I know? Life's not done. This is not all we get. And there'll be time for us to restore some of what was taken.
When you talk about the bond between mother and daughter, I was an only child of a very young mother, and my biological father abandoned us. So I didn't have any relationship with my father. I still don't have a relationship with my father. And then she also married an abusive man like your mother did. And that creates a lot of interesting connection. And I know that's not the topic of our conversation, but I wanted to tie it into the bonds that we have with our own mothers in relationship to how the home is, how the home dynamic was. Now, we left him when I was young, but the aftershock of being in an abusive relationship and her needs, and the kind of personality that I was, because all of these things happened before I had those filters,
Yes.
I was young. I didn't have any filters. And so I think we need to look at ourselves. The empty nester needs to look at themselves and realize that we may have unmet emotional needs, or we may have inappropriate expectations or unrealistic expectations, because maybe, and I've had to go through this myself, in wanting to have a healthy, whole relationship with my children And knowing what that looks like to have a healthy, whole relationship and working very hard to do the work so I could be healthy and whole for my children.
Yes.
There's a lot of bond breaking going on both sides. And
Yes.
so an empty nester might need to actually go, like you said, backwards, look back and see if some of this grief, some of this challenge is because of maybe expectations that were placed on them that they're carrying forward and not even realizing it. It's the awareness of, wait, is this me or is this me repeating history? Because I think it's natural to repeat the history. It's natural to do what was done to us or whatever, but it doesn't have to be that way. And yes, it's still going to be painful, but isn't there a better way a lot of times to do these things? And if there is, then we need to get the help we need so that we can make that transition without losing ourselves completely.
You know, repeating history is not what you want. And many of you, I'm sure, have mothered and feel like you have mothered better than you were mothered. Of course, we bring our things into it, don't we? Your children will sit in their own therapy about things that happened in your home, because unfortunately, nobody is perfect at this. And that includes me as well. You know, I see that more and more as I sit with people. But the gift is that you've done the best you could. And as you look back, you can say, you know what, I was guilted in coming. We're at the holidays. I was guilted in coming home for Christmas. I don't want to guilt my children over that. So it's taking what was done to you, what didn't feel good, and saying, what can I do to make it a pleasant experience? I always say to my children, visit us when you're done with everything else. Come the weekend before. It really isn't about the date, is it? It's about coming together. And if there's a time when us as a family can have a day, what an awesome thing over the holidays. And releasing some of that. I just remember having to say, oh, we're going to have to do 2 Thanksgiving dinners on Thursday because nobody wants to release, having their children at home. Well, let's rethink that a little bit. Let's give our children some say. And those of you that maybe are looking forward to college students coming home, enjoy that time before there's a spouse that says, we have to be at my family's this weekend. This comes down to, Gina, enjoying the moments we have. Because now our children are going to be enjoyed in times. We don't have them every day. So it's those moments that we need to treasure. And I say quality over quantity. Make them wonderful times. Even if it's sad, even if underneath you're crying because you know they're leaving the next day and you miss them so much.
As you were talking about that, I was telling my girls, because our house is the holiday house. It has been the holiday house since I got married. It's really the only place we can do holidays.
Okay.
For different reasons. And so I don't mind. My house is the gathering place. So I've kind of been the matriarch for years, even though there were 2 moms, And one of the things that I came to is I realized, I told my girls this year, I was like, we've never talked about this, but I want you to know that all these little holidays, like not Thanksgiving and Christmas, but like the smaller ones, all the other ones, because literally when I say my house is the holiday house, it's like Memorial Day and Labor Day and 4th of July and all the big ones.
You are blessed, Gina.
So I said, if you guys have somewhere you want to go, you want to hang out with friends or whatever, I want you to know, because I think this is part of the empty nesters, is because we are their parents and they do, most of them want to do what makes us happy. And if you're close like I am with my girls, I try to, quote, give permission and just say, you know what? You're an adult. If that's the way you want to spend your time, I just ask that you come for Christmas and Thanksgiving, please hit the big ones. But if something comes up and, your friends are going down to the beach for a bonfire for the 4th of July or whatever, I want you to know that it's okay for you to do that. That'll be an adjustment for me, but I want them to I want them to enjoy where they are, not be
Right.
doing it out of obligation.
That is key because it's about relationship. And I love what you said, permission. There's a lot of often hidden guilt, isn't there? It's not that we're guilting them, but they were like, I've got to go home. I've just got to go home. And it's that underlying guilt that we want to say, no, you know what? A holiday can span a little bit of time, and we're going to give you guys the say on that. I often will say to my three, listen, talk to each other. Determine when your vacations are, working, when in-laws are taken care of, and get together then. And then let me know. And we're going to be fine with that because we're going to flex for you guys. And of course, there are times when Greg and we might take a vacation or something, but we're going to make that work when we can get them all together. I think the more children you have, the harder this is too to organize. So if you've got 6 kids, it's hard to get them all together at the same time, depending on their vacations and the families on the other side, the in-laws, especially if they're married. It can become a trick, and the times may be farther and farther that you have all of them. We have to be okay with that because life goes on, doesn't it? And then the times that you do have, instead of being negative, then being positive about what you have. If you're a glass half empty kind of gal or guy, it can be easy to say, this is what I don't have, instead of valuing what I do.
As you're talking, I was thinking, finding the joy in the moment, really being present with it as it is. It's expectations that catch us up, isn't it?
It sure is.
Just having expectations of, quote, how it should be or how it was because that's back to what I was saying earlier. Our children are their own human beings, and they will have some dynamics from being a part of our family, the culture that we've created, if
Sure.
you've been intentional in that way. But at some point, if our goal is for our children to be healthy, like, we have to get out of our own way and not be selfish and really look at them and say, how would I want them to live their life? How did I want to live my life? And
Right.
if, let's say, you weren't given that permission, then maybe now's the time to come to Jesus about that in your own mind.
Yes.
And release your children from the thing that you felt beholden to. Because why carry on something that, like you said, steals the joy? Like, you're not able to enjoy the time because you're being negative or you're feeling the lack. Finding the thing to celebrate, getting used to looking for those moments of celebration instead of, oh, they're going to be gone soon, like mourning before they leave.
Right. You're dreading it before they go. And, especially if your emotional tank was filled by your children, and then to go to where that comes intermittently, we have to begin to fill that emotional tank with other purpose, with our marriage, with friendships. And so some of you may be sitting out there and life has been pretty empty. Well, we need to begin to say, what do I need? Not everybody needs a ton of friends. Some of you are filled with friendship. I mean, that's what comes to you. You've got your days are planned. You're doing lunch. You're doing dinner as couples with couples. And that's what does it for you. Some of you need a little more me alone time. But it is really our job as parents to stay happy and healthy. And that benefits our children who do come home on occasion to see that we are doing okay. And together as a couple, becoming friends again, playing, finding things we have in common, and maybe grieving out the hurts and losses that we've caused each other in the years prior. So there's a lot going on in Empty Nest. And listen, I'm speaking to the choir here because I'm in it. And, the things that I'm telling you, these are hard and difficult things, but so worthwhile to bring us to a point of new purpose And then we haven't even spoke about grandchildren coming, but that brings another dynamic, of joy and input, not full responsibility, but another, element for those of us that are blessed to have a grandchild.
And the sharing of your children must be difficult as well, because my girls are unmarried as yet. So I don't have to share them with another family.
Yes, I noticed, Gina, that you said, Christmas and New Year's are done here, but it isn't long until you'll have spouses and they'll begin to switch off. And then that's when we need a little bit more creativity with timing. So it isn't that it doesn't happen, but December 25th may not be the Christmas day for the family gathering. And you know what? It's really, I want to tell you, it's okay. It's okay. You can plan to do maybe a service. Maybe you're going to go out and give out food on Christmas Day, do giftings for people in need. If you want to give your children that freedom, you can celebrate on another time and serve others on that day, or create another Christmas tradition. I wanted to also bring this up. Those of us that are really traditional, that means we have created a lot of traditions. Traditions are wonderful, but they can also be a source of hurt as well, because the tradition is no longer kept. Think of getting the tree. This past week, I saw a lot of young families, and they're going out and they're cutting a tree, and it may be from the same yard that they've always, the same farm that they've always gone to. And listen, traditions like that are awesome, but when they cease, that can be another source of emptiness. So then you have to install, create new traditions. Maybe there's a cookie baking night with grandchildren, or you have to institute things that are more workable. Filling up and letting go. So tradition would be, we're filling our house with tradition. Then the after empty nest, it would be releasing those traditions and perhaps creating new traditions that fit more in line with adult children. But traditions can be a source of real loss during the holidays, things we always did. They can be an endearing thing for children, but for parents, it can be a loss.
I was kind of putting it into context, and, be excited when you can carry on a tradition, but maybe we need to compartmentalize traditions to seasons of life as well, as opposed to a tradition is something we do from birth to death.
Mm-hmm.
Seasons
Yes.
the traditions possibly.
Right. It's that ability to flex and be flexible that moves us through the developmental stages. Think about that. We have to be flexible. If, for instance, say that you've been a really involved mother, and now we've got an adjustment, don't we? Child's in school, they're working, and they don't need us as much. And so we must become flexible and say, I can let that go. I don't have to check his grades. I don't need to be on his social media account to check on him. I can trust he's going to be fine. And he's going to call me, or she's going to call me when they're ready. And so we want to just use that flexibility. And that would come with holidays too. We've got to learn to flex. And Gina, can I just say to you about your girls, enjoy these years. They're coming home. You're still the main mama in their lives. And that's awesome. So relish those days.
I'm always thinking ahead, though. I'm one of those that I'm trying to look for ways to make it easier for all of us to make the transition that is coming. I try to be present, but I also try to look ahead and really be aware of, we don't get everything perfect, but I can be intentional and make it less traumatic or make it less difficult. Or how do we remove the guilt? And for a lot of people, Denise, this really comes down to if we find ourselves using guilt, maybe we were guilted, identifying that emotion and thinking, did I really enjoy being guilted? Like, was that a thing I just looked forward to? And why would I do that to the children that I love?
Exact. This is key, because guilting, just think about friendships. Do you have a friend that guilts you? It doesn't feel good. much less coming from a parent who guilt trips their children to convince them to be more involved. So you know what? You want to be wanted as a parent. And they're not going to leave you totally. I mean, I know that that can happen if the relationship is suffering, but time and space are good. We miss each other. They'll miss you and they'll call you, and it'll mean so much more than if you've guilted them. So evaluating that, and you know what, getting someone else to look, sometimes we can't see that in ourselves. Maybe talk to your spouse about that. Honey, do I guilt the kids? Your children being allowed to share their voice, say, Mom, you're guilting me right now. I've actually had my child say that to me. Mom, you're guilting me here. And I go, oh, you're right, I am. Because I didn't mean to. But I was a little bit whiny, maybe, about a decision that was made. So we need that open conversation. And then once you realize it, what boundary needs to be set so that you can love each other with a choice? Love each other well because they choose to call, because they choose to come.
And how much more enjoyable is it when they want to be there? There's more opportunity to love and be loved when it's willing.
If it undermines the relationship, then we're probably doing some damage. So wanting to love and developing that friendship, one of the things I noticed with my boys and my husband, and I didn't have a present father either, and so I value that he's been a good dad, but for them to call and say, Dad, I'm working on this and I don't know how to do this, that's amazing. Those are precious times. That's what parenting should be as we move on, isn't it? They want to hear from us. They're stuck in life and want a perspective. I know that this generation, they really come across as Googlers, and they don't necessarily say, call Mom, but there are times when they need us. And that is what we're building toward, isn't it? We're trying to keep that friendship, keep that open communication and that closeness, so that when the chips are down for our children, we're the call that they make. And I hope today, I'm not sure what I've touched on, but maybe there are some who are listening, and this has just begun to open a thought or a conversation. I hope that you will reach out and get help for that. There are many good people in the area that you're at, and rethinking and maybe some journaling, opening up a conversation with an older person, doesn't necessarily have to be a counselor, somebody who has lived this. It's just a good thing. We all need those voices. And Gina, you're doing a good work in this podcast because it gives support and helps others know you're not alone in this journey of adult parenting and empty nest.
It's such a challenge to parent at all because we have our own stuff. And one of my goals was not to pour stuff into their bags from my bag of stuff, trying to figure out how to do it, not perfectly, but in a more healthy way.
Sure.
Than what I understood. One of the things I told my mom way back in the day when my kids were really little, we'd had a conversation about this is the way our family does things. She was saying that. And I was like, okay, did it work?
Yes.
And why would I do it that way? Like, I want to make my own mistakes as a mother. And of course, my husband is my partner, so I'm not alone in this parenting. I haven't talked much about him, but he and I was more of the disciplinarian, I'm the more driven personality. So definitely he was there and we talked about everything, but execution tended to land on me because I was into execution. I was into carrying out the vision. I'm a bit of a sergeant, like, okay, this is how it's going to be. And as long as we're in agreement, we're moving forward. So because we weren't the wait till your father gets home family.
Right.
I think there's even deeper emotional ties for me because I was driving the intentional train. And so now I realize, well, I've been doing this for a few years, of course. Stay in that intentional train, but it's going to take a different track now. Like you said, it goes from parenting to coaching to mentoring. There's this process. And
Yes.
if we manage that process well, it doesn't remove the pain, but it gives us purpose in the relationship. It kind of helps us keep context so that, yeah, we're sad, but there's still this thing that we get to do. And there's things to discover about yourself and your children, and watching them become the people that they're really meant to be, because they're not me.
Right. And you know what? They will take then from your home the things that they've learned and things they want to change, and they will bring that into your grandchildren's lives. So we need to know nobody's perfect living on the earth. We have things that we have failed in, but the good that we have done, we can be confident in, and we can say, I have done what I could, and I'm going to give them the freedom to do what they need to do in their own life. And if we just give them that voice, Gina, we would just give them that voice, that helps in relationship.
I love that. One of the things that's been important for me as a mother of daughters is to give them the voice, to give them the power to understand they have a voice and to use that voice, and to help coach them to feel not guilty or waiting for permission to use their voice. And in order for me to empower them to use their voice somewhere else, they have to be able to use it here.
Exactly. It's exactly what you've raised them to do. And they're going to use it in relationship to you. Isn't that what we want?
Right? You do reap your rewards when, you're honest with your kids. So for me, I say, of course I want you here, but it's important that you have power in your own life. If I want my daughters to have a voice in the world as a whole, I have to give them the power to have a voice at home. It's all that training for how they're going to act out in the world. It comes from home. So when we think about the empty nester syndrome, and letting go, we can't be selfish about it. We really have to think about, our children as individuals who deserve the right to live life on a term that makes sense to them.
Exactly. Isn't it? It's interesting that you put it this way, because really what we're training them in, to have this ability to say yes and no and set boundaries, and it all comes back to us, doesn't it? Because they're going to do it with us. And it's what we've trained and want them to do.
Exactly.
It is a deep mutual respect that begins to develop between parent and child. We're no longer, the power scheme has changed, and now we're friends. And what a special relationship that can be. And if you have maybe some unfinished business, like my mom and I did in the story I told earlier, then let's work through that, because it is worth it as we move through life. Have grieve out those old losses that we share together, so that we can move together in peace and harmony.
Wonderful. Well, we have come to the top of our hour, Denise, and we've talked about a lot of really important things, and a lot of things that may stir some strong emotions in some of the people that are listening. So if you could wrap up 3 gifts to a person going through empty nest and struggling with it, or just trying to figure it out and navigate it, because when you do it the first time, it's the first time you've done it. You may not have the skills. Why don't you give us 3 really good tips that we can use to navigate becoming an empty nester?
So I'd like to first say that children need loving parents. And if you're no longer married to their father, perhaps you can work on the relationship of friendship, so that you're getting along better with them if you're not married to them anymore. Or if you are, that the marriage grows. Children love it when their parents love each other. And so I would encourage you to get to know each other again, and to find a common play that you can do. Greg and I, work very hard and we enjoy projects, but that may not be you. Maybe you enjoy hiking, refinishing furniture, doing things that produce, maybe rescuing pets. Whatever it is that can draw you together and have time, work on your marriage first for your children. And then know that if you've lost purpose and have emotional distress, there is hope. Listening to podcasts like this, talking to friends who are going through it, and then if it is pretty severe, I encourage you to get in to see a counselor. The amount of love we love is the amount of grief we have. And if you've been a dedicated mother that had a lot of time with her children and valued that so deeply, know that your job has been done and that you can move to a new place of normal. It is understandable that you're going through distress because you are a dedicated mother. An empty nest hits hard. There is hope from this. And then if you have anxiety about your children or feel the need to guilt them, I hope that you will trust them, that you will give them their voice so they can say, "Mom, you're guilting me," and allow them the freedom to call and come because they want to. And by setting them free when they call, you'll have that knowledge. They need me. They still do need you, but they're realizing it, that your job as a parent, while it may be changing, you have given them what they need to go on with life. I hope that the next weeks through the holidays are blessed and that you will value the time that you have with each one of your children.
Well, thank you so much, Denise, for sharing that. I think this conversation is so necessary, so needed for a lot of people who are struggling to find their place in the world again once their children have grown and gone. So I think it's very important. So thank you again for saying yes to me and spending this time together.
It's been great. It's been a good reminder for me, especially as the holidays come. So
yes. As we're recording this, we're heading into Christmas. Those of you who are listening, you're hearing it actually after a Valentine's Day. So it's going to give you a good running start for all the holidays for 2020.
Coming up, and there'll be plenty.
That's right. So I've been speaking with Denise Broadwater. She's a licensed professional counselor. She's the debut author of A House with Holes. She was #1 in Kindle in the home design and renovation with her book, and she was #1 hot new release for several weeks. She's still in the top 100. So if you head over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 137, there you will find hyperlinks to Denise, her website, her books. You can find out more about her, maybe get in contact with her. I want to thank you again, my tribe, for joining us today. And I highly encourage you to do the hard work, because the soil, the more we till it, the more we water it, the more we give it what it needs, we will reap a greater harvest. So in your season of being an empty nester, don't forget, build your marriage, find a new purpose, give a voice to your children. You will only reap greater rewards if you do. Thanks again for listening today. We look forward to talking to you again next week. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.